The sun was dropping low over the dry desert when Tarzan, a lone Apache warrior, rode through the silent trail with dust rising behind his tired horse, his injured arm pressed against his chest, and his sharp eyes scanning the land for danger because he knew bounty hunters were somewhere close, hunting him for a crime he never committed. The evening was calm, too calm, the kind of stillness that makes a man feel like something bad is watching from behind the rocks, and Tarzan could feel that strange warning in his chest as he pushed forward, hoping to find a safe place before nightfall. But as he turned around a bend in the trail, he suddenly pulled the reins hard, stopping his horse because right in the middle of the road stood a young woman holding a small baby, her feet bare, her clothes covered in dust, her hair messy like she had been running for days, and her eyes wide with fear. She didn't scream or run when she saw him, she just stared with shaking hands, hugging the baby so tightly that the child's blanket was almost tearing apart. Tarzan felt confused because women in this land never waited in the open like this unless something was terribly wrong. He slowly stepped down from his horse, keeping his hand close to his knife, and asked in a low voice who she was and why she was here, but instead of answering, the woman whispered, "Please, don't leave us. Please help." Her voice trembled like the last breath of someone who had lost everything. Before Tarzan could ask anything else, a loud snap came from the bushes behind her, the sound of someone stepping on a dry branch, and then Tarzan saw movement, 3 armed men coming out, their eyes fixed on the woman and the baby like wolves ready to attack. The men cursed when they saw Tarzan, surprised that she wasn't alone, and the leader pointed his gun at her and shouted that she should stop running, that the boss wanted his property back, and that she should hand over the baby. Tarzan felt a fire rise inside him because even though he didn't know her, he could see fear in her eyes, and he could see that the baby was going to suffer if these men caught them. So without thinking twice, he grabbed the woman by the arm, pulled her onto his horse, and kicked the animal forward, starting a desperate race through the open desert as gunshots exploded behind them. The horse ran fast across the rough land, jumping over rocks and dry bushes, while the woman held the baby close to her chest and cried softly, repeating over and over again that the men would not stop until they had the child. Tarzan shouted through the wind, asking who these men were, who she was, and why they wanted the baby, but the woman only answered one thing, her voice shaking as she held the baby tighter. "He thinks I'm your wife, he thinks this baby is yours." Tarzan's heart almost stopped at her words because he had never seen this woman before in his life, and he shouted back that she was not his wife and he had no child, but the woman only looked at him with a painful expression, like she knew something he did not. When the horse slowed down to catch its breath, Tarzan finally looked properly at the baby for the first time. The baby's face was small and soft, but the eyes, those deep brown eyes, looked exactly like his own. The child stared at Tarzan without blinking, and for a moment the world around him went silent. Tarzan felt something strange, something heavy, like the past was trying to speak to him through the child's eyes, but he didn't understand it. The woman watched his reaction and whispered, "He looks like you because he is yours." Tarzan's body went cold because he knew for certain that he had never had a wife, never had a child, and never even met this woman before today, so how could she say such a thing? Before he could demand the truth, the distant sound of horses came again, those same hunters chasing them, getting closer with every second. The woman begged him not to leave them, saying that if the men caught the baby, something terrible would happen. Something she could not even describe. Tarzan didn't know what to believe, but he knew one thing clearly, she was terrified, the baby was innocent, and the armed men chasing them had no mercy. So he forced his horse to run again as the sun disappeared behind the cliffs and the desert grew darker. As they raced deeper into the wild land with danger behind them and mystery ahead, Tarzan felt the biggest question burning inside him, why did this baby look like him, and what truth was this strange woman hiding? And in the dark, with hunters closing in, he realized something even more frightening, whatever the truth was, it was about to change his entire life forever. The desert night was dark and cold as Tarzan urged his horse faster, the wind cutting across his face and the baby crying softly against the woman's chest, and though he tried to focus on the path ahead, his mind was spinning with questions he could not answer. Who was this woman? Why did she say the child was his, and how could this be possible when he had never had a family or a home? Yet when he glanced down at the baby, the small, curious eyes seemed to recognize him, and the child reached out to grab Tarzan's finger, holding it with surprising strength, and in that moment, a strange warmth and fear settled together in his chest, making him feel both responsible and afraid of what he might discover. They slowed near the edge of a dry creek bed, where the shadows of rocks provided a small hiding place, and the woman, finally able to catch her breath, whispered her name was Mara, though she hesitated and refused to give her full story at first, only saying that powerful men wanted the baby because of its birthmarks and because it was believed to carry something special, something that could bring them power, and Tarzan felt a chill run down his spine, realizing that this was no ordinary chase. No simple misunderstanding, but something much bigger and more dangerous than he could imagine, and he could hear the faint sound of horses and voices far behind them, reminding him that time was running out and the hunters would not stop until they had the child. Mara explained, her voice shaking, that they had been hiding from a cruel ranch owner named Colton Briggs, a man feared across the territory, and he believed the baby belonged to him, though she insisted it was not true, that the child had been born in secret under strange circumstances, and Tarzan listened closely, his jaw tight, his eyes never leaving the dark horizon for fear the hunters were closing in, while the baby, wrapped in Mara's arms, began to calm in Tarzan's presence, cooing softly. When he spoke, and it seemed almost magical how the child's cries stopped whenever Tarzan touched him, as if the baby somehow knew he was safe with this man. Tarzan felt a storm of emotions, anger at the men chasing them, fear for the child's life, confusion about his own past, and a growing sense of duty he could not ignore, because even if the truth was unknown, he realized he had to protect both Mara and the baby no matter what, and he knew the desert offered little mercy, no second chances, and every decision now could be the difference between life and death. They moved cautiously through the rocks, keeping to the shadows, the wind whispering through the canyon as though warning them of danger, and Tarzan kept his hand on his knife while Mara held the baby close, shivering, whispering that she had seen men following them since sunrise, tracking them through the heat and sand, and that Briggs would not rest until he got the child, and Tarzan's heart hardened, understanding that they were not just running for survival, but running against the greed and cruelty of a man who would destroy anyone to get what he wanted. As they reached a small cave tucked under a cliff, Tarzan forced the horse to stop and helped Mara and the baby down, keeping his eyes on the horizon, and for the first time since the journey began, he allowed himself a few moments to look at the child's face in the dim moonlight, seeing the soft curve of the lips, the small nose, the deep brown eyes that seemed to stare directly into his soul, and he felt a pull so strong he could not explain, as if some invisible thread connected him to the baby, binding him to protect this life above all else, and Mara watched silently, knowing he was beginning to understand, and whispered softly, "He is yours, Tarzan, you must protect him, no matter what." The hours passed slowly, filled with tension and silence, broken only by the baby's small movements and the occasional distant howl of a coyote, and Tarzan could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him, the knowledge that this was not just a fight against men with guns, but against a cruel world that did not value the innocent, and yet he also felt a strange sense of hope, because even in this darkness, the baby's presence reminded him that life could be precious and worth fighting for, and that somehow, no matter the danger, they would survive if he stayed vigilant. Outside the cave, the sound of hooves grew closer, and Tarzan's body tensed, every muscle ready for action, knowing that the hunters would find them if they stayed too long, and he whispered to Mara to be quiet, to hold the baby close, as he planned their next move, realizing that escaping the desert was only the beginning of a journey that would reveal truths about himself, about Mara, and about the child, truths that would shake everything he thought he knew. And as the moonlight fell on the baby's peaceful face, Tarzan made a silent promise to himself, no matter what happened, he would protect this child and the woman who had trusted him, because somehow, against all reason, they were now his family, and in the quiet, tense desert night, that promise felt heavier and more powerful than any fear or danger that waited beyond the rocks. The first light of dawn began to creep over the desert cliffs, painting the rocks in shades of orange and gold. But Tarzan did not slow his pace, his horse moving swiftly through the uneven terrain as his eyes scanned every shadow, every ridge, every dusty trail for signs of the hunters who had been chasing them all night, and Mara clutched the baby tightly against her chest, whispering softly to calm him as his little hands reached out toward Tarzan, who could not stop glancing down at the child with awe and confusion, for every moment with the baby only made the impossible seem more real. The child's dark hair, its eyes, even the way it watched him, made Tarzan feel as if a piece of his own soul had been handed to him in this fragile, innocent form, and though he still could not understand how this had come to be, he knew he would protect the baby no matter what, even if it meant fighting men far stronger and crueler than himself. As they navigated the narrow canyons and rocky outcrops, Mara began to tell Tarzan more of her story, her voice trembling but steady, explaining that the baby's father, though she claimed it was not hers to name, was a man named Colton Briggs, a powerful and merciless ranch owner whose reach extended across the territory, and that he believed the child carried a special mark, a sign that would give him control or luck or power, and he would stop at nothing to take the baby. And Mara's fear was not only for herself, but for the child who could be lost forever if Briggs succeeded. And Tarzan listened carefully, his jaw tight, his mind racing as he calculated their next moves, realizing that running blindly would not save them, that they needed a plan. Yet every path seemed dangerous, every canyon shadowed, and every ridge could hide a rifle aimed directly at them. The baby stirred in Mara's arms, cooing softly, and Tarzan felt a surge of protectiveness he had never known before, a fire igniting inside him as he realized that even if he did not understand the full story, even if he did not yet trust Mara completely, he could not let these men harm this child, and he had never felt so determined in his life, for the stakes were higher than his own survival. This innocent life depended on him. And for the first time in many months, Tarzan felt a purpose that burned brighter than the sun on the desert sands. As they crept along a hidden trail toward a small, abandoned homestead Mara claimed she knew, Tarzan noticed tracks in the dirt, fresh horse tracks, too many to be a single rider, and he knew the hunters were close behind, watching every move, waiting for a mistake, and he felt the familiar tension rise in his chest, the kind of tension that made every heartbeat loud and every breath shallow. But he also felt the calm determination that had carried him through countless battles, and he vowed silently that no one would take the baby from him while he still drew breath. Mara's voice trembled as she told him that Briggs had men everywhere, people who were willing to lie, steal, or even kill for their master, and that if they were caught without a plan, they would be lost. Yet even as the danger pressed from all sides, Tarzan noticed small signs of life in the desert, birds calling in the distance, the wind shifting just enough to hide their scent, the rocks providing cover, and he used every skill he had learned as a warrior to lead them safely, always keeping the baby between himself and danger, always scanning the horizon for movement, and every moment he felt the weight of responsibility grow heavier on his shoulders. By midday, they reached a small grove near a dry riverbed, where Mara allowed the horse to rest while she fed the baby small sips of water, and Tarzan took the moment to study the child closely, tracing the tiny fingers, the soft round cheeks, the eyes that seemed almost too wise for a newborn, and a deep question gnawed at him. How could this child exist, and why did it belong to him when he had never known a family, when he had only ever known survival and solitude? As he sat silently, Mara told him that there were rumors among the people, whispers of a child born under strange signs, a child whose life would be fought over because it carried hope, strength, or power, and though Tarzan had never believed in prophecies, he could feel the weight of the truth in her voice, in the way she looked at him and the baby together, as if they were already connected by fate. The distant sound of galloping hoofs made them both tense, and Tarzan leapt to his feet, readying himself to fight or flee depending on the danger, and Mara held the baby tightly, her wide eyes scanning the rocks for any sign of movement, while Tarzan whispered urgently, instructing her to stay low, to trust him, and to be ready to run if needed, for he knew the hunters would not give up, that they were relentless, and that the desert offered no mercy to the weak or unprepared. And yet, despite the fear, Tarzan felt a strange sense of clarity, a certainty that he would not fail, that he would face whatever came, and that he would protect this child even if it cost him everything, because the bond had already formed in ways words could not explain. And as the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows over the desert, Tarzan led Mara and the baby to the edge of a rocky bluff, ready to move again, ready to fight if necessary, and ready to discover the truth about the child, about Mara, and about the path fate had laid before him, for he knew now that this journey would change his life forever, and that nothing, no man, no desert, no threat, would stop him from keeping the baby safe. Night had fallen over the desert, turning the rocky canyons into long, dark shadows that seemed to move with every flicker of moonlight, and Tarzan led Mara and the baby carefully through the uneven terrain, his every sense alert to the faintest sound, the slightest movement, because he knew the hunters were still following, relentless and cruel, and with every step, the weight of responsibility pressed heavier on him as the baby's small body shifted in Mara's arms, the child's quiet whimpers mixing with the distant howl of a coyote, making the silence feel even more dangerous, and Mara kept glancing nervously behind them, whispering that she thought they had lost the hunters but now feared they were circling, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, and Tarzan's hand never left his knife, his eyes scanning the horizon, the shadows between the rocks, and even the sky, as he tried to predict where danger might come from next, knowing that one mistake could cost all three of them their lives. They finally found a narrow canyon that provided some cover, a place where the rocks rose high on both sides, and Tarzan told Mara to sit down and keep the baby quiet while he watched, taking a position slightly ahead, his body tense like a coiled spring, ready to attack or defend at any moment, and as he crouched there, he could hear the faint crunch of boots on gravel, the whisper of movement, the low voices of men plotting in the shadows, and he realized that the hunters had found them, that there was no escaping without a fight, and a deep sense of determination settled over him, stronger than fear or fatigue, because he knew he had to protect the innocent life in Mara's arms. Mara clutched the baby tightly, whispering softly to calm him, and Tarzan could feel the child's small heartbeat against her chest, each tiny pulse reminding him that this was no ordinary fight, no ordinary danger, but a battle for survival, for family, and for the fragile hope that the child represented, and he felt a surge of anger at Briggs and his men who would kill without thought to claim a child for their own greed, and Tarzan knew that he could not let them win. As the sounds of the hunters drew closer, Tarzan moved silently, signaling Mara to stay low, to keep the baby hidden, and he listened to the men arguing in low tones, planning how they would take the child, and he could almost feel their cruelty pressing against him, suffocating, as if the rocks themselves were whispering threats, and yet, even with the danger so near, Tarzan felt calm in his focus, every muscle ready, every sense sharpened, and he knew exactly what he had to do. The hunters finally revealed themselves in a small clearing ahead, their guns glinting in the pale moonlight, and Tarzan's heart raced as he realized they were more numerous than he had expected, at least half a dozen armed men, their voices harsh, demanding the child, and Mara trembled beside him, the baby letting out a small whimper as if sensing the danger, and Tarzan whispered words of comfort to them both, urging them to stay still, while he crept closer to the edge of the rocks, planning the first strike, knowing that surprise was their only chance. The night seemed to stretch longer, each second heavy with tension, and as the hunters moved into a better position, Tarzan could see the leader's face clearly, a cruel sneer that promised no mercy, and he felt a flash of anger that gave him strength, the kind of strength that only comes when protecting those who cannot protect themselves, and he knew that he would not let these men harm Mara or the baby, no matter the cost, no matter the risk. With a sudden motion, he lunged from the rocks, grabbing one man by surprise, twisting his arm, sending his gun clattering to the ground, and the others shouted, firing wildly, but Tarzan moved like a shadow, striking, dodging, using every skill he had learned in the desert, in the fight for his life, in the endless days of running and surviving, and Mara shielded the baby, following Tarzan's commands, moving through the chaos, holding the child close, whispering that he was safe, even as bullets flew past, rocks exploded around them, and the hunters screamed in frustration and pain. The fight went on, brutal and fast, until the last of the hunters fell back, some fleeing, some wounded, and Tarzan, breathing hard, looked down at Mara and the baby, both safe, though trembling, and felt a wave of relief and exhaustion wash over him, the kind that comes after surviving a storm that could have destroyed everything, and he realized that this was only the beginning, that Briggs would not give up, that more dangers would come, but for now, in the silence after the fight, he felt a connection with Mara, with the baby, a bond forged in fear, courage, and the understanding that he was now responsible for their lives, their safety, and the future of the child. And as the desert night stretched on, quiet except for the occasional howl in the distance, Tarzan made a promise to himself that no matter what happened, he would protect them both, fight for them, and uncover the truth behind the baby's mysterious origins, because whatever secrets lay ahead, he knew that they were now his family, and nothing, not fear, not darkness, not men like Briggs, would take them away from him. The first light of morning barely touched the desert horizon when Tarzan realized that staying in the rocky canyon was too dangerous, that Briggs' men would return with more numbers and more weapons, and he knew they had to move quickly if they wanted to survive, so he helped Mara onto the horse, holding the baby close to her chest, whispering words of calm while scanning the desert for the safest route, every sense alert to the slightest sound, the faintest shadow, knowing that even a single mistake could cost all three of them their lives, and as they rode, the wind whipping past them, the horse's hoofs kicking up clouds of dust, Tarzan could feel his pulse racing, his muscles tense, ready to act at a moment's notice, and Mara, her eyes wide with fear and exhaustion, kept the baby pressed to her chest, murmuring soothing words, while the child's tiny hands clutched her shirt and his soft cries seemed to fade whenever Tarzan spoke, as if the baby somehow sensed his protection, giving Tarzan a strange mix of fear and hope that surged through his veins with every step. They moved through narrow trails and hidden washes, weaving through the rocky desert, taking paths that would be impossible for anyone to follow without knowing the land, and yet the distant sound of hooves and shouts told Tarzan that Briggs' men were still hunting them, relentless, patient, and cruel, and he realized that there would be no safe place until they reached a distant river he remembered from his past journeys, a river that could hide them, provide water, and give them a chance to think and plan, but reaching it meant crossing open desert where any misstep could be their last, and Tarzan's mind raced with possibilities, weighing every decision, every turn, every shadow, knowing that Mara and the baby depended entirely on him. As they reached a wide open plain, the hunters appeared in the distance, their guns raised, and Tarzan's heart pounded as he kicked the horse into a gallop, urging Mara and the baby forward while dodging rocks, small bushes, and the uneven ground that threatened to throw the horse off balance, and the hunters fired, bullets kicking up dust near them, one even grazing the horse's flank, and Tarzan shouted, "Hold the baby close. Don't let go," as he guided them through the chaos, ducking under low branches, jumping over rocks, and using every trick of the desert to stay ahead, the sound of the wind, hoofs, and gunfire mixing into a harsh symphony that made the ride feel like a battle with death itself. When the hunters closed in, Tarzan led them toward a narrow riverbank, where the water cut a winding path through the desert, and as they reached the edge, he realized that crossing now was risky. The river was cold, the current strong, and the rocks slippery, but there was no choice, no other way to escape. The men determined to take the child, and he leapt from the horse first, grabbing Mara and helping her lower the baby into her arms, shielding him from the cold water as best he could while guiding her across, step by careful step, the water rushing around their legs, chilling them, but giving them cover from the hunter's sight, and Mara whispered small, fearful prayers as the baby stirred, letting out a tiny cry that seemed to echo across the river, making Tarzan tense, knowing any sound could reveal their position, yet the child's small, trusting grip on Mara's shirt reminded him why he could not falter. Halfway across, the hunters appeared at the river's edge, raising their rifles, shouting threats, and Tarzan's mind raced as he grabbed a long branch, using it to push the hunters back just long enough for Mara and the baby to move safely, his strength and skill in the desert giving him every advantage he had learned over years of survival, and even as bullets splashed into the river, stirring up water around them, he never wavered, never let the fear take him, knowing that protecting the baby was more important than anything, more important than his own life. Finally, they reached the opposite bank, exhausted, soaked, shivering, but alive, and Tarzan helped Mara find a small cluster of rocks where they could rest, the baby still cradled in her arms, now quiet, seemingly sensing the safety of reaching solid ground, and Tarzan, breathing hard, looked at the distant horizon, knowing that this was only the beginning, that Briggs would not stop, that the desert would continue to test them, but also feeling a small surge of hope, because they had survived. Because the child was safe for now, and because even in this harsh land, there were moments of victory, small victories that gave the courage to face the next danger, the next night, the next wave of threats, and as Mara whispered softly to the baby, telling him he was safe, that they would keep him, that Tarzan would protect them both, Tarzan felt a weight lift slightly from his shoulders, knowing that for now, they had won this battle, that they had crossed fire and water and survived, and though exhaustion pressed down on them, he could not allow himself to rest completely, for the desert was alive with danger, and their journey was far from over, but in that moment, with the baby secure, Mara safe, and the river behind them, Tarzan allowed himself to feel the tiniest spark of hope, the first breath of peace in a long night of fear, knowing that together, they would face whatever came next. As the sun began to rise, spilling golden light across the desert and illuminating the dusty rocks and dry riverbeds, Tarzan led Mara and the baby cautiously toward a small Apache village he had once known, its huts hidden among cliffs and scrub, offering safety and the possibility of answers, and though his legs were tired and his arm ached from his wound, his focus never wavered, every sense alert to the danger that might still be following them, because Briggs' men were relentless and would not rest until they had the child, and Mara, still holding the baby close, whispered softly to calm him as she glanced nervously at the distant horizon, every sound of wind or bird making her jump, while Tarzan scanned the land, calculating every step, every possible trap, knowing that one mistake could undo all the struggles of the last days. As they approached the village, an elder appeared from the shadows of a hut, his eyes narrowing as he observed Mara and the baby, and Taza felt a strange mix of hope and tension, unsure if this stranger would help or question their presence. But Mara immediately recognized him and, with a trembling voice, whispered the truth. He was a trusted elder of her people, someone who had once guided her and could help explain the mystery of the baby. And as Taza handed the child to Mara for a moment, the elder motioned for them to follow him into the shade of a hut, his eyes filled with wisdom and recognition, and Mara began to speak, revealing her full story for the first time. She had once helped Taza when he had been injured months ago, hiding him from enemies, feeding him, and caring for him, and during that time, they had grown close, though circumstances had separated them, and now the baby in her arms, she confessed, was theirs, a truth Taza struggled to comprehend because he had lost his memory after his head injury and had never imagined fatherhood. Yet as he looked at the child's face, the same dark hair, the same deep brown eyes, the same small gestures, he felt a pull in his chest that was undeniable, the realization settling slowly that Mara had told the truth and this baby was indeed his, a tiny piece of himself living and breathing in the desert light. While Taza tried to process the overwhelming truth, the elder explained the danger they still faced. Briggs would not give up, his men were many, and they would come to the village if they discovered the baby's location, so the only option was to prepare, to hide, and to protect the child at all costs. And Taza, feeling both fear and fierce determination, vowed silently that no matter what happened, he would defend Mara and their son with every skill, every ounce of strength, and every drop of courage he possessed, for nothing would break the bond that had been proven in blood, sweat, and the long nights of running across the desert. As Mara whispered to the baby, cradling him against her chest, she spoke of hope, of family, of a future that had seemed impossible until now, and Taza, despite the shock and the whirlwind of emotions, felt a sense of purpose and clarity he had never known, realizing that the child's life, their survival, and the truth of their connection were now his responsibility alone, and that he would not fail. Just as the first rays of sunlight touched the village, a scout returning from the edge of the desert warned that Briggs' men had been spotted nearby, their shadows moving across distant cliffs, plotting, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike, and Taza's heart tightened, knowing that the calm he felt could vanish in an instant and that every second counted, every decision mattered, and the safety of Mara and the baby depended entirely on his courage and his skill. He quickly organized the villagers, instructing them on defensive positions, telling them to stay low, to hide the baby if necessary, and to prepare for the inevitable confrontation, while Mara stayed close, holding the child, whispering reassurances, and Taza felt the full weight of fatherhood and protector's duty pressed down on him, heavier than any burden he had ever carried in his life, but he also felt strength in it, a resolve that hardened like steel in the desert sun. As the hours passed and the shadows of distant riders grew closer, Taza kept a watchful eye, noting every movement, every sound, while Mara clutched the baby, now quiet and resting, his small fingers curling around hers, and Taza realized that the bond between him, Mara, and the child was unbreakable, tested by danger, by desert nights, by gunfire and fear, and now ready to face the final challenges, the ultimate truths, and the men who would stop at nothing to claim what was theirs by blood and by fate. And as the village settled into tense silence, Taza took a deep breath, feeling the desert wind against his face, the warmth of the rising sun, and the life of the child in Mara's arms, and he knew, with absolute certainty, that he would fight to protect them both, no matter the cost, no matter the danger, because the baby was his son, Mara was his family, and this moment marked the beginning of a new chapter, one where courage, love, and survival would define everything that came. Next, the desert was quiet, the sun low in the sky, casting long shadows over the rocky cliffs. But Taza's mind raced as he prepared for the inevitable. Briggs and his men were coming, relentless as the wind that swept the sands, and he knew this would be the final fight, the one that would decide whether Mara and the baby would live or die. And as he positioned the villagers, assigning them roles to hide, distract, and defend, he felt the weight of responsibility heavier than ever, the tiny life in Mara's arms a constant reminder of why he could not fail, why he had to fight with every ounce of strength and skill he possessed. For the child was his, and Mara, the woman he had begun to care for deeply, trusted him with everything, and he would not betray that trust. The first signs of movement came from the ridge, distant shapes appearing, horse hoofs kicking up dust, men shouting and waving their weapons, and Taza signaled for Mara to stay low, to hold the baby close. As he crouched behind a rock, his knife ready, his eyes sharp, his muscles coiled, knowing that surprise and strategy were their only chance, and as Briggs' men approached the village, their confidence clear in their loud taunts and harsh laughter, Tarzan felt a fire ignite inside him, the kind of fire born from desperation, duty, and love, a fire that made him fearless. The first clash came quickly, a mix of gunfire, shouting, and the crash of rocks as men scrambled for cover, and Tarzan moved like a shadow, striking quickly, dodging bullets, using the terrain to his advantage, drawing some men away from the main group while others tried to flank the village, and Mara clutched the baby, whispering softly to keep him calm, as Tarzan's skill and the villagers' knowledge of the land allowed them to counterattack, sending Briggs' men into confusion, their numbers meaningless against the determination and strategy of those defending their own. Bullets whizzed past, striking rocks and splintering wood, but Tarzan kept moving, pulling the attackers one by one into the shadows, fighting with precise, deadly force, his anger and protective instinct combining into something unstoppable, and every time he glanced at the baby, who now cooed softly in Mara's arms, he felt renewed strength, knowing that the child's life, and the life of the woman he had come to care for, depended entirely on his courage and skill, and that failure was not an option. The battle raged through the afternoon, the desert echoing with shouts, gunfire, and the sounds of struggle, until finally, Briggs himself appeared, leading the remaining men with a cruel sneer, his eyes fixed on the baby, as if the child's existence was a challenge to him personally, and Tarzan's heart pounded as he stepped forward, ready to face the man who had caused so much fear, pain, and chaos, knowing that this confrontation would end everything, for better or worse. They circled each other across the open ground, Tarzan low and ready, Briggs arrogant and reckless, and then with a sudden movement, the fight began, fast and brutal, Tarzan dodging strikes, using the man's momentum against him, and Briggs swinging widely, underestimating Tarzan's speed and skill, and as they battled, Mara stayed behind rocks, the baby safe in her arms, watching with wide eyes, knowing the man who had been chasing them would not leave without bloodshed, but also knowing that Tarzan would not fail, that he was their shield and their strength. After tense moments, Tarzan disarmed Briggs with a quick twist and knock, sending his gun clattering across the rocks, and with the villagers surrounding them, Briggs realized he was outmatched, his pride and fury turning to desperation as Tarzan held him at bay, every motion precise, controlled, and deadly if needed, and the man finally gave a defeated sneer before retreating, his remaining men following, leaving the village silent except for heavy breathing, the cries of a few wounded birds, and the soft coo of the baby in Mara's arms. Tarzan lowered himself to the ground, exhausted, sweat mixing with dirt, and Mara approached, holding the baby toward him, her eyes filled with gratitude, relief, and something deeper that Tarzan felt in his chest as he took the child carefully into his arms, feeling the tiny heartbeat, the warmth, and the undeniable connection that proved this was his son, his family, and a future worth protecting, and he looked at Mara, who smiled softly, tears streaking her face, and for the first time in months, in years perhaps, Tarzan allowed himself to feel peace, the relief that they had survived, that the danger was gone for now, and that the bond between them was unbreakable. As the sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the desert, Tarzan held the baby close, Mara beside him, and he whispered words he had never imagined saying, words heavy with truth and love, "You are my son, and you are safe. She is my wife, and we will protect each other." The village slowly returned to life, the fear fading, replaced with cautious hope, and Tarzan knew that while more challenges might come, they would face them together, as a family forged in the desert, tested by fire, fear, and survival, and that nothing, not man, not desert, not time, could ever break the bond between him, Mara, and the child. And as night fell and the first stars appeared above, the warrior, the woman, and their son stood together, stronger, united, and ready for the life that lay ahead, a life of courage, love, and protection in a wild and unforgiving world, and in that quiet moment, Tarzan finally allowed himself to feel the joy of victory, the pride of fatherhood, and the peace of knowing that they had survived, together.